I'm Alice, just reflecting a little bit on lockdown from 2020 and onwards. It feels like a million years ago, to be honest. Everyone's gone back to their normal life. No one's really taking tests anymore. No one is really, thinking about not sneezing on each other. A lot of people are still, just blissfully ignorant about it all, which is a bit terrifying, to be honest, how quickly everything got locked down and for how long it got locked down. We were all told it was just going to be 3 weeks, but it's still having an effect almost 3 years later. The main things I think about when I look back over lockdown is just how much more anxiety I've now got over the tiniest thing. Just if there's too many people, if there is, someone particularly sick nearby, if I've got a cold, I still will go into work and wear a mask, even if I know it's just a cold and it's nothing worse. And working with children, I've always got a cold. The anxiety levels definitely shot up during lockdown, and have always suffered with my mental health. Had things like OCD and stuff been pre-diagnosed from as early as possibly 4, but it definitely all took a massive toll on me. I think it just heightened all these extra issues, and I'm now medicated, which I'd always said that I wasn't going to be, but unfortunately I had to give in, and it was just not safe for me to not be medicated anymore. In hindsight of lockdown and everything, especially with what came out after the whole COVID thing kind of got forgotten about and everything, is that a lot of our politicians were doing things that they had told us not to do, that they had then ended up doing themselves. And yes, they got into trouble for them. And by listening to the rules, I was then robbed of the last opportunity to have Christmas in my family home with my father, who unfortunately passed away not that long ago, not due to COVID at all, but due to our house fire. And it just meant that we lost everything, including him. And I nearly went home that Christmas, but I decided to listen to what the government was telling us and doing as they say rather than what they were doing, which in hindsight I wish I'd just ignored them and just risked it and just gone back. I'd taken tests to check that I was all fine, but I didn't want to get in trouble. But in hindsight, I should have just paid the fine, because I can't get that Christmas back. All those memories in the house, everything's gone. The only thing that survived was Mum. So, that was probably one of the most horrible things to come out of lockdown, is just that, yes, we lost a lot of people to COVID as a nation and also as a world, but all those other bits that we've lost out on that we can't get back, that I don't think many people have contemplated about. Lots of extended family members have missed out on saying goodbye to other family members, or even watching small children grow up. So many of our children that I teach and that we have coming through our classes, you can just see the difference between the ones that have been surrounded by a significant number of people before and have grown up in that kind of environment that we had pre-COVID. But then you can also see the massive difference between the children that now aren't used to having large groups of people around them and are used to cleaning their hands all the time. Lots of our kids still don't like getting given a stamp on their hand because they then want to immediately clean their hands because it's dirty. It will take time, and eventually, hopefully they will get out of those kind of routines, or maybe they'll just be a cleaner generation, but hopefully it doesn't have a negative impact on them in the long term. But hopefully it just means that they're a little cleaner and they wash their hands a bit better, with the arguments of how many times you're saying happy birthday, because that was one of the biggest things that our kids would argue over, if you sang it once or if you sang it twice. Before COVID, I had bought a new franchise for the dance school that I run. It was the first time taking it over, and we were getting very excited about all the different things that we could do. We were in the process of starting our first show that I was in charge of. We'd run shows before where I'd just been, a normal teacher, but this time I was in charge. If anything went wrong, it was all on my head kind of thing. And the show was supposed to be at the end of March in 2020. Obviously, it didn't happen. We postponed it initially to the July, thinking that, this will only be 3 weeks. We'll have more than enough time to get it sorted. But we then had to postpone to November, and then we postponed again to the following July. And through the gritted teeth and only just managed to get the show approved. We had to have people with 2 seats between them. Everyone had to wear a mask. They were only allowed a certain number of tickets. Children had to, be very distant from each other, which then put into effect how many chaperones we had, because you have to have a certain number of adults to children. It then raised the whole getting them changed, because these children are 3, 4, 5, 6 years old. They're not able to get themselves changed completely independently at the speed you need for a show that's running. We also had the issue of the skin costumes, which are full-on costumes with a headpiece on and everything. We had to work out who could use them between the rest of the franchisees, because they had to have a certain amount of time not being used to then be safe enough for another person to use. It was just a nightmare. And I'm so glad that it was our first show, because anything else has now just been easier. So we've done one more show since then, and that was what I would call a normal show. There was no specific COVID restrictions in place. We still had hand sanitizer and everything everywhere anyway, but we didn't have to get the hall and the theatre venue fogged in between each show, which again was a nightmare. We're due to do another show this year, which we're very excited about, to hopefully have no COVID impact on at all, because no one tests anymore, no one checks. And I suppose unless you're of a really high risk category, you wouldn't really think about it anymore. You would just sit there and think, oh, it's just a cold, or if it is COVID, it's fine. Everyone's much more relaxed about it now, because a lot fewer people are dying from it, basically. The good thing to come out of COVID from a business point of view, though, is that I was supposed to take over 2 more areas from a franchise point of view. I was going to be doing that in the December before COVID hit, but what actually happened because of some issues is that I didn't end up taking it over until the April, which then meant that from a price point, I then got it for much cheaper, because COVID had already hit and people were more desperate to, get rid of business because they weren't sure they were going to survive the lockdowns. So from a community point of view, because the anxiety was so high, I didn't really leave the house an awful lot. And also I was busy teaching on Zoom morning, noon and night, which was hilarious, in between trying to get our ceiling fixed, because we didn't have a ceiling at the time. Because again, a lockdown's a great time to take the ceiling down while you're trying to teach in that room. Although I didn't leave the house, I do remember seeing so many things on Facebook with different people doing different activities for children and young families, where it was a painted stone and they just leave it somewhere, and it basically a little trail for the children to get excited about, or putting pictures up in the windows and rainbows and bits and pieces like that for the NHS to show the support. And those kind of things I think really helped, especially the children, because their comprehension of it, it was tough for us, but we could understand what was going on, whereas especially for really young children, they couldn't understand what was going on. They could probably figure out that some people were making other people poorly, so we had to stay inside and stay clean. There was an amazing book, and I can't remember it off the top of my head, that someone had written during lockdown, and it was basically just explaining that the world is going to be cleaned, and that's why we're all staying inside nice and safe, and then once we come out it will be all clean and fresh, and we'll be able to be fine. And I ended up reading that plus a couple of other books on a Zoom, recorded, and sent it out to all the children that I teach as well, just as an extra little bit for them to do. Same with my older children, we had a weekly challenge. So how many star jumps can they do in a row, or how long can they hold their handstand against the wall, and bits and pieces like this, just to try and get them interacting with each other And our Zoom meetings were always, our Zoom lessons were always, we'd log in 15 minutes before class and we'd still be there 15 minutes after, so that if the kids did just want to have that chat, they could, because quite often they wouldn't be able to see their outside of school friends because they just couldn't, unless the parents had their contact information, which quite often they don't, because they just see them at dance. And so we did try to build the community from a dance school and dance school's point of view to try and help both the children and the grown-ups have different things to do. And the head office of the franchise that I have were amazing in that they made sure that we had loads of extra resources. We had some of our branded characters doing dances with them. We had story time with them, which are now all things that we're now utilising still and starting to expand on, just because it was so successful and helpful in the lockdowns, because there was the whole lockdown experience, if that's even the right word, is probably the closest my generation has been to anything like a war in previous times, with reference to not being allowed out at certain times, not being allowed to do certain things. One of the things that I really remember is going into the shop. I'd finally been convinced by my partner to go to the shops with him, which we weren't supposed to do. You weren't supposed to go with more than one person. But he'd finally convinced me to leave the house just to pop to the shop. There was gaps of food. There was hardly any food anywhere, and it just felt worse. It just felt awful. And I think one of the running jokes now is that we can't say avoid it like the plague, because we had a plague and no one avoided it. So many people didn't listen. And I think in reflection, if my grandchildren or whoever goes through something similar in the future, even though I wish I hadn't listened to the government and had gone home for Christmas to see my dad before he passed away and to see everything one last time before we lost it all, it doing something for the greater good is still going to be better than being selfish for 5 minutes and potentially harming lots of other people.